have 3 tests that are given to our students every year. 2 of them are necessary. The 3rd one is optional. Do you know why it's optional? Because NWEA just wants the data. So we are paying, we are spending additional dollars and time and resources on a 3rd test that has nothing to do with our students and has everything to do with data gathering on the part of NWEA. This was a deal that was made with our former superintendent, who at the time was on the board. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. I want to give you my perspective as a parent in terms of testing. I'm also an architect, and I teach an architecture class to children. And I see the effect that this kind of testing has on children. I see the standardization come through in terms of the lack of their ability to express themselves creatively. My daughter came up in a private school, and she was in private school through 6th grade in California. She had a great education, no standardized test. We moved to Seattle. I chose to live on Mercer Island. The reason I chose Mercer Island was because I didn't know any better. I saw that the WASL scores were very high. I thought, well, if you have high test scores, it must be a wonderful school. So that's where I put her, in Islander Middle School. We had a huge culture shock when she got there. Everything was tested. The focus was on the WASL test. The information was dumbed down. My daughter loved math and science. She would talk to her teachers about physics, things like string theory. But when she came to Islander Middle School, there wasn't anything like that. You had to learn the information. You had to be able to take the test. She would come home all stressed out and in tears and say, Mom, they know how to take a test and I don't. She'd say, but then they leave the room and they can't say anything. They don't know what they've just taken. They don't understand. We can't have a conversation about it, but I can. Well, we got her out of that school. We got her, actually she went to Mercer Island High School. Someone suggested Nova High School here in Seattle. It's a wonderful, project-based, student-oriented school. She loved it there. And that's where she ended up. She is now back on track, and she wants to study environmental sciences. So I thank the stars for a wonderful science teacher there named Adam, who got her back into her love for math and science. So that's my experience with standardized testing, and it doesn't get any better from there. The rest of this I'm going to read, because I couldn't remember it all if I tried. I understand the need for tests. Teachers need to know where their students are academically. But when those scores are tied to funding, or worse, labeling teachers, schools, principals, superintendents, and districts, that's wrong. Tests as tools are useful. Tests used as weapons to label teachers and schools as failing, used as a reason to close schools, leaving students and communities without a school, or worse yet, replacing this closed school with a charter school, as we have watched happen around the country, is wrong. Ultimately, that is how the MAP test is to be used here. It is to be used as a weapon, not as a tool. There is proposed legislation right now in Olympia championed by Republicans and straight out of the ALEC playbook. This bill would make it mandatory to grade schools. The failing schools would be closed, and we all know what schools that will be. We see that happening in Chicago, New Orleans, and Philadelphia, where hundreds of neighborhood schools are being closed, and that could happen here. Neighborhoods have been devastated due to these school closings, and the students who do not attend the resultant charter schools are left out and become lost in the system. We also need to reframe the conversation and change the language that is used. Instead of grading teachers, we need to support them. Instead of grading schools, we need to have a discussion about what works in our school districts and focus on replicating those approaches and ideas. Instead of closing schools, we need to ensure that they are fully funded and supported. Instead of politicians making school policy, educators, parents, and students need to be making the decisions. In the real world, class size does matter. Schools do need adequate funding. Well-educated and experienced teachers do make a difference, and we don't need the MAP to know what's working and what isn't for our students. In Snohomish last year, 550 students opted out of the MSP. Their representative, Mike Hope, introduced House Bill 1293. This bill holds the district and state accountable for administering a standardized test. Some of the provisions of accountability are: it is to be stated whether the test has been screened for bias. Parents are to be told if the test is required for graduation. The MAP test is not. Parents are to be told how the test results will advance student learning, the amount of time that will be spent to administer the test, and what the cost will be to the district and state to administer the test. This is changing the conversation and taking control of it. I ask all of you to please contact your representatives and let them know about this bill and inform them of its importance. We need to turn the conversation around and focus on what works. Just ask you to follow us on Scrap the MAP website and on Seattle Education blog, and join us on Facebook. I just opened up a group on Facebook called MAP Test Boycott Parent Support, where we're starting the conversation on opting our students out and providing information and providing support for other parents. Thank you.
First of all, I want to congratulate the teachers at Garfield High School and tell you that your voices have been heard across the country and also have had international impact. I've had emails from colleagues in Australia and the United Kingdom, New Zealand, talking about what is happening at Garfield High School. Of course, they don't have any idea what's happening, other than the fact that the entire faculty stood together and said, that's enough. We're not going to do this anymore. It's not right. It's wrong for our students. It's wrong for education. And we say no. That's the message that's gone around the world, is that people have stood together courageously. It would be my wish and my hope that Garfield High School would not stand alone in Seattle, but that many other high schools would join with them with the same unanimity as the Garfield staff. That would send an even more powerful message, would be to have the entire high school faculty of the Seattle Public Schools opt out as the Garfield teachers have opted out. So I hope that happens. But meanwhile, what you're doing in Seattle, what you're doing in Garfield, is resonating with what's happening in our country. I was at a rally just this past weekend in Austin, Texas. It was called Save Texas Schools, and there must have been at least 10,000 parents and students and teachers and grandparents and people from across the state. It was just amazing. The guy who put it all together was a theater teacher, and you could tell, because my gosh, this rally was staged with just tremendous panache. It started with a marching band from one of the high schools in Houston. The kids were all decked out in blue uniforms, and it was a full band, and they had about 30 cheerleaders tossing their batons, and there were drummers, and the number of students there supporting this rally was just so impressive. And that's what gave it life, that, you know, who are the big stakeholders here? This is their life, this is their future, and it seemed as though the kids understood far from the legislators that their lives and their education were being sacrificed on the altar of testing. Texas is a particularly sad situation because the legislature there cut $5.4 billion out of the public school system at the same time that they awarded a testing contract to Pearson for almost $500 million. So they couldn't find money for instruction, but they found plenty of money for testing. And, you know, my own view is, and let me step back before I give my own view. Stuck over the country. Students in Rhode Island held a zombie protest in front of their State Department of Education because the high school graduation test is going to cause almost half the kids not to get a high school diploma. And most kids will be blind, Hispanic, and disabled, and in one way or another will be kids who have the same opportunity to learn. And the students know it's unfair. So when the students get it, you do wonder, why doesn't the state commissioner, why doesn't the state board of education, why don't all the public officials? I'm sure you know about the students in Portland, Oregon, who said they're going to opt out. There have been thousands of people who passed resolutions. I think it is a growing movement, and what's happening at Garfield is so important because because it shows an entire faculty saying no. And on my blog, I have said and will say again that if the teachers bear any financial penalty, I help raise money. I'll post notices every day encouraging people to send checks, to go to whatever the website that's been posted to raise money. And I think the teachers will respond, and it's very important to show financial support for what's happening. So. Here, I wanted also to mention where I see all of this fitting together. What's happening nationally, and has been going on now for the past several years, is an unprecedented effort to privatize public education. The privatization movement rests on a flawed narrative, a phony narrative. It is what many years ago David Berliner and Bruce Spittle called a manufactured crisis. Let me tell you three very fundamental facts, which I hope you'll bear in mind. Number one, the test scores of American students today are at their highest point in history. The test scores of white students, black students, Hispanic students, and Asian students, as judged by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They are at their highest point in history. The graduation rates for every one of these groups is at its highest point in history. The dropout rates are at their lowest point in history. You will not hear this on any of the mainstream media. You'll hear this crisis narrative, the gloom and doom narrative, and it's a phony manufactured crisis. Our public schools are doing an amazing job. Where we do have very serious problems or where there is a concentration of poverty and racial segregation. That is a toxic combination. And where we find two situations to get the high racial segregation, you find test scores. So these so-called reformers, these corporate executives who want to take over American education, ignore the root causes and instead blame teachers, and instead come up with these, cock-out ideas that you can judge your quality by test scores. The main thing that the test scores predict is the wealth or poverty of the family. The most important part of test scores, or the best predictor of test scores, is family income. So all you're doing with the test scores is saying, go to districts where the kids are affluent, you'll be a great teacher, and if you teach where the kids are poor and there are many with disabilities, you will not be a great teacher. This is a nutty system, and to show you how crazy it is, there's no other country in the world that's doing it, and yet it's being... So, we all do what we can. What I'm doing is this. I have a book coming out this fall where I'm going to explode the reformer narrative by laying out all the facts, all based on U.S. Department of Education data about the test scores are the highest ever, the grad are the highest ever, the lowest ever. It's a narrative that has been foisted upon us by these corporate stalwarts. America has been trying for 100 years. Our teachers are doing an amazing job. And teachers should be judged. They should be evaluated, but they should not be evaluated by test scores. They should be evaluated by professionals, by their peers, and that's the appropriate way to evaluate teachers. When you explain this, well, they get it, but we're stuck on this notion that somehow we're going to raise up the achievement of children if we just keep testing more and more and more, and this is ridiculous. Testing is not teaching. We need more instructional time and less testing time. So the message that I will leave you with, and it's late here and it's early there, is that you should mobilize, get more people to stand up, see if you can get more high schools, elementary schools, junior high schools to join you, because this entire privatization movement rests on data. And they should not have this data. This data is simply a measure of, as I said, of socioeconomic conditions. And you should deny the data whenever and wherever you can. Don't do anything to jeopardize your job. And if you always act in solidarity, you will not jeopardize your job. If you stand up alone, you will be the nail that gets hammered. But acting together, there is safety in numbers and there is strength in numbers. And so the more people who opt out, the more act in unanimity, the safer you are. So please urge your colleagues to join with you, join with Garfield High School, stand together and set this nation on fire.
I teach 4th and 5th grade at Orca K-8. Right after winter break, or actually during winter break, my good friend Jesse from Garfield called me and said, guess what we're doing at Garfield? Guess what's just happened? Guess what's sprung up? And immediately when the first Monday back from break, met with Orca teachers, pulled them together. As Marion said, this is an act of civil disobedience. This is insubordination under our teaching contract. I mean, we are taking we're taking a risk, an employment risk, and we did have a threat of a 2-week unpaid suspension. The same day we had a massive rally, also the same day that 2 other high schools joined in the boycott. Ballard High School and Chief South High School joined the day we were threatened with a 2-week suspension. That has been verbally withdrawn with the verbal caveat that we will face some sort of discipline. And as Marion said, it's being insubordinate and going against. They're elementary teachers. There's something really sweet and nice, and there's rainbows and butterflies, and we want that for our kids. And I have to say, I'm a parent of a kindergartner and a 2nd grader at Orca K-8. I immediately opted them out as a parent, of course. My daughter's teacher, my daughter's kindergarten teacher, she's 73 years old. She's been working at Orca this is her 43rd year. She actually founded the school. It was a part of a different elementary that doesn't exist anymore called Allen Free School. And it's called Allen Elementary, sorry. And she saw the kids sitting in desks and lined up in rows, and this is when I was 2 years old, actually, in 1969. And she said, I want something different. I want something where kids are sitting together in groups. I want something where kids are working on projects. And here at Orca K-8 it grew out of her. She started it with just a kindergarten, 1st grade program. She has grown it. Now it's like 43 years later. She's our matron. She is our leader. She was the 2nd teacher after myself to join in the boycott. She started the school. Yes, Marletta, fantastic kindergarten teacher. She started the school based on the idea of project-based learning, based on student-centered education, based on students having their own lives reflected, which is so the opposite. I've always said, the emperor's not only naked in this situation, he's like playing with himself in front of us. And it's disgusting because the amount of money, when you look at, and I'm really excited to hear Wayne Au come up and speak. He wrote a book called Unequal by Design. Came out a couple years ago. It's the history of the standardized testing movement. And as a teacher for 21 years who's worked with, who's committed my career to low-income students and students of color, and used to see my job as getting them ready to jump through these hoops and jump through these hurdles. And this is part of life, and this is what's going to be expected. And part of what I need to do is help them negotiate that life between their life and what's expected through the school system. Once I got exposed to Wayne's book and realized that standardized testing came out of the eugenics movement, that came out of the movement to prove white superiority over people of color. So standardized tests were created for a gap to exist. And now we're supposed to be pulling our hair out and lamenting about the achievement gap, or what we've reframed the opportunity gap. When these tests were designed for there to be a gap. And then we're giving these tests and going, wow, why is there a gap? These tests are, as the title of the book, unequal by design. And so I'll leave it at that because I want to leave some extra time for Wayne to speak. But I'll just say, as a teacher at Orca K-8, I'm proud there are 12 teachers at the school who have opted out of giving this test, who are boycotting the test. Those of us who are boycotting have over half the families. We have a lot of families that have gotten involved at ORCA who are also opting their children out. I mean, they've chosen an alternative education through the public school system for a reason, and it's not to load up on these tests. It's to really focus on project-based learning, kid-centered learning. I thank you all for being here, and thanks.
Thanks so much for being here. At Ballard, I teach physics and astronomy. 5 classes, about 160 kids. Seattle Public Schools funds that college prep project-based curriculum to the tune of $0.00 per year per student. That's what we're spending our money on. At Ballard, we were sort of taken by surprise, but we got a solidarity letter together the day after the first Garfield press conference. On the day that the 10-day suspensions were announced, I sent a letter to Mr. Bonda personally saying, suspend me too, please, I'm boycotting. Haven't heard back. At this point, we have 40 teachers at Ballard who are committed to boycotting, which means really give us the same punishment. Let's go. We have nearly unanimous support of a letter in support of the Garfield teachers, but you know, like every other school, we've got teachers with mortgages and bills to pay, and not everybody can afford to take that risk. It's a very, very brave thing to do. So that's where we're at right now. I wanted to say a couple other things. I've been studying the statistics of the MAP test a lot, and one thing I've learned is that as soon as you say statistics or math, people's eyes glaze over. So I'm not going to go there, except to say, if you have some capability in understanding math and statistics, you owe it to yourself and to all of us to study up on this stuff. When, as a parent, and I am a parent in Seattle Public Schools as well, you get a number next to your kid's name, you got to think, well, what does that number mean? Is a 5 really a 5, or could it be a 6, or could it be a 4? And it can. There is measurement error. That's one of our prime beefs with this test, is the measurement error is so huge from take to take to take, it doesn't really supply teachers with valuable, useful information. It can be as much as a year, a grade year off in terms of really assessing kids. It's very frustrating and useless. You can put a number on anything, even a kid, but that doesn't make it right. Not at all. I also want to mention that probably one very likely outcome of this whole business is that they will shove another test at us that we don't know as much about. And one of the things we've seen with this MAP test is mission creep. They bought it for us teachers to use for formative assessment so we could learn the strengths and weaknesses of our kids. We haven't received any training for that in years. What it is used for is as a gatekeeper to advanced learning programs and as a tool to get at teacher evaluations. So whatever the next thing is, beware of mission creep. We must demand that we get an honest answer. Why are you buying this test? Really? What do you want it for? And finally, I should say something about, what do you do if you don't have these tests? You do what teachers do, authentic assessment. Go to the SAT website. What did they say is the best predictor of college performance? High school grades. Not standardized tests, but high school grades. We do assessment every time we talk to a student. What do you think this is about? We do assessment when we do quizzes and tests, but we do assessments when we do presentations, when we do group activities, when we do projects. We do all these things. I assess kids in 53 different ways, or 180 different ways. And that makes it real because kids are not all the same. And tests like this presume, Tests like this presume that everybody learns at the same way, in the same order, as if we were coming out of a factory. And I reject that. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll keep my comments really brief so we can get on with the rest of the presentations and hopefully also the questions and answers. But yeah, we're one of the high schools that has very strongly come out in support of the Garfield action as well as boycotting the MAP test. Now, what that means for South, I think is very significant because we were actually one of the high schools, one of the schools to pilot the MAP test when it started about 4 years ago. And I think it's important to note that the staff, you know, approached this in an open-minded way. And we gave the MAP test as instructed. And initially, this was a test that was given 3 times a year. And then it became painfully clear that, first of all, with all of the results from these MAP tests that were being administered 3 times a year, there really wasn't much time to even take a look at them because there was never this idea that teachers would be given time to then assess the results and then do something about it. And then the next thing that became clear was that the results themselves were very faulty. There wasn't much that one could do anyway with the results. And so the other thing that became painfully clear was that it was occupying all of the time of our students with the computer labs, taking them out of class. And so I think collectively teachers began to add it all up and realized that this was not a really good use of time. In fact, it had nothing to do with what they were teaching in the classroom. And so given all that, it was pretty easy for us as a staff to gain supermajority support for the boycott itself. Now, I have to point out, because I want everyone to understand this, that even when teachers boycott a test, as we have done at South, it doesn't mean that the test doesn't go forward. Because unfortunately, the test was administered to our students by the administration because they were under directive to do so. Now, what the other part of that means, though, is because of the awareness to this test, the number of students who chose to take that test went down significantly. The numbers were probably dropped to, instead of having, you know, full classrooms taking the test, more like maybe 1/3 max out of those classrooms. So that's been a positive, I think, result of the MAP test itself. We still have a lot of work to do going into the spring. We're going to have to continue to work to make sure that the spring MAP test doesn't get given again. And the other thing that we need to do, and we'll be doing very soon in the next week or so, is talking to our PTSA, because our parents have a lot of questions about this test now. They've been hearing about it, they've been reading about it, and we've talked to the leadership of PTSA, and they have decided, yeah, it's a good thing, let's take this to the general membership meeting. So we'll be talking with them in the next week or so. I think a lot of people want to have a bigger understanding of what this MAP test is about, and it's also really important because it opens up the whole issue of standardized testing anyway, which is something that we all need to take a look at. So thank you for putting together this panel. We are very much part of the Scrap the MAP committee, organizing committee, and we'll continue to work together to end this.
So my name's Kris McBride. I am the testing coordinator at Garfield High School. Proud to be a part of this faculty. And so being the testing coordinator, I have lots to do with the MAP. And basically, the teachers decided they didn't want to give it. And I said, okay, that sounds good. What are we going to do now? My teachers have been incredibly motivating and inspirational to me. I stand up a lot in front and say, yep, we're not doing it. But it's our teachers that are saying that. That message somehow gets channeled through me. But I want everybody to know that Garfield, regardless of how few teachers are directly impacted by the MAP, we stand as 93 teachers and educators together in saying that this is wrong for our kids. So, huh? So there are lots of reasons why the MAP sucks. You know, you could ask a different teacher at my school, and they might have a couple of different reasons out of the 15 that stick kind of at the top of their brain. But here are the ones that are high on my list. It's not high stakes for the kids. It doesn't matter to them. It doesn't impact their grade, their graduation, and it doesn't help them. There aren't interventions. We don't get us, you know, like the previous speaker was talking about, or one of the previous speakers, you know, get the scores and then do what? Well, hurry up and get ready for the next MAP test. Hope those scores go up. There aren't interventions. I heard somebody from another school on the task force, and somebody at one of the other schools who's represented on the task force said, we know we get these scores, and then we look at the scores, and we might put them in an extra math class or give them this extra support. And I thought, well, where are your dollars coming from, and where's that extra time coming from? We don't have that at our school, and I bet I'm not alone in saying that. There are no opportunities to use those numbers in a way that's meaningful at all, at all. It doesn't match what the curriculum that my teachers are teaching. Not that they would know that, because they don't get to see anything that's on the test beforehand. How are they supposed to prepare these kids? But if you look over a kid's shoulder while they're taking the test, there's some geometry on there. Wait a minute, aren't you rating me as an algebra teacher right now? That seems problematic. And I agree with the teachers. That seems wrong. So, you know, we could go on and talk about why this test in particular is bad for kids. And I know that the movement has gotten bigger, and we're looking at standardized testing as a whole. But, you know, Mary earlier talked about something that really touched me. It brought it right back down to this particular thing in this particular school for these particular teachers was bad for their kids. And that's when teachers said, we can stand up. It doesn't have to be just the union leadership. Not that they're not meaningful and powerful. But we, as the people who know what's best for our kids, can stand up and say, no, it's not going to happen again. And the last thing that I want to share with you tonight is I was asked to share some of the numbers of what should have happened during the winter testing window and what did happen at Garfield. When I originally set up the testing thing for winter, before all of this came down, there was about 800 tests that should have been given. And that's not necessarily kids, because some kids are taking one test, some kids are taking 2 tests. It depends on what group they fall into. So out of the 810, let me bring out my numbers here. At the end of the testing window, there were only 184, so less than a quarter completed valid tests. So just like at Chief Sealth, our administrators were told, you need to go in and make this MAP test happen. So our administrators, because they had to, walked in, pulled kids out of classrooms, walked them down to the computer lab and said, do this, take the test. And we had 104 kids themselves that sat in front of the computer and said, no, I won't. So we had a... So we had 104 kids that said, nah, I'm just going to make it invalid. I'll just push the buttons as fast as I can. Look, I'm done. And that yields an invalid result. We had 273 parents that contacted me directly and said, I want you to opt my kid out. I don't know if my kid even is supposed to take it, but I hope not. It's stupid. And some of their kids were slated to take 1 test, and some were slated to take 2. So I know those numbers don't all add up to 810, and it's because, you know, it's because some of it's tests and some of it's I'm counting kids. So keep that in mind. But when we saw these numbers, we were not only proud of what we're doing, but the parents that are standing behind us and the kids that know we're standing up and taking these risks because we're worried about them, our primary concern. So anyway, thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. It means a lot to us Garfield teachers, and it's just been an incredible ride to see a group of educators stand up and demand to be heard and say, you know what, we're the experts in education, not the billionaires who have not attended public schools and are pushing tests that they don't understand the impact on our kids. It's been amazing to see teachers get a sense of dignity and pride and a sense of power. And you know, it really started when we had an all-staff meeting at Garfield. And we had done a lot of small meetings around beforehand, and we knew there was a lot of support, but we didn't know exactly how this all-staff meeting was going to go, where we discussed whether we should boycott it as an entire school. And there was a lot of questions for me as the union rep. What's going to happen to me if I decide to boycott this? And I didn't sugarcoat it, you know. It could be labeled insubordination, and that could lead to a whole series of progressive discipline that could unfortunately negatively impact your livelihood, right? Those weren't the words that won the room over to support the MAP test. It was actually, I think, a courageous teacher who said, you know what, this test is going to label me and my kids a failure, and I'd rather face discipline for standing up for what I believe in than just for sitting back and letting this system run over us. And I remember that vividly. Because that's when we took a unanimous vote to say our kids are more than this test score that the MAP test is spitting out, that we want to train our kids to think critically and problem solve. We know that the problems we face in the world today don't have simple A, B, C, or D answers, and we know this test isn't helping to train critical thinkers. In fact, it's robbing them of the class time they need to be successful in their class. So that's why we took a stand. I just want to end by saying that tomorrow is the final day of the MAP test window for the winter. They extended it a week. It was supposed to end last Friday, but they have now designated tomorrow as the last day of the testing window, which means that tomorrow teachers around Seattle, at Garfield, at Orca, at Chief Sealth, at Center School, and at Ballard could be labeled insubordinate, and that we could, starting tomorrow, face sanction of some kind. We hope that the district works with us and that they understand that we have a unanimous vote of the PTSA board at Garfield High School in support of the MAP test boycott. We had a unanimous vote of the student body government at Garfield, and we had a unanimous vote of teachers. And we hope that they understand that when we speak with one voice as an educational community, that they would respect that voice and that they would allow the task force process to go forward and investigate the fact that by their own recollection that this test has a higher margin of error than expected gains. We would hope they would listen to those and not go after teachers who are trying to do what's best for the kids, right? We hope to work in dialogue with them. But if they do go forward with anything, we're going to need your support. We're going to need your help to spread the word. To bring solidarity messages forward, to come to rallies, and we're going to need help to make sure this movement stays strong, because everyone around the country is looking at what happens here, and we know that Washington State is the #1 state in spending on standardized tests. We spend over $100 million a year in Washington State on standardized tests, and the entire nation is looking to see, will this be a crack in that wall, right? I'll just end by saying that we know in our classrooms who are not at reading level or who are not at grade level. The thing that we need is the funds to help get them to where they need to go. We need the money for the after-school programs, the tutoring programs, the reading help, reading coaches. We need the support that the state has been found guilty by the state Supreme Court of failing to fund education. And so we would hope that the district would be organizing an effort to try to help get the funds that we need rather than going after teachers that are standing up for a better education. Thank you.
I want you all to understand that high-stakes standardized tests are not the objective measures of teaching or learning that we often pretend or think they are. I'm choosing to focus on what I'm calling the non-objectivity of high-stakes tests because it's clear to me that so much of the current corporate education reform agenda literally operates on the one assumption that the test scores themselves are valid and accurate and even just measures of student learning and teaching. Whether it's the practice of evaluating teachers on student test scores, what's called value-added measurement, grading schools, districts, or states according to test scores, and we know we have that bill that Dora mentioned working through the legislature here, enforcing exit exams, justifying school closures, arguing for charter schools, arguing against the teachers' unions, pushing to use Teach for America. All of these corporate-styled education reforms rely on the argument that the test scores generated by students taking the high-stakes exams are free of any taint or bias or inaccuracy. Well, I'm going to tell you that it ain't true. So let's start with some history, and thanks to Matt for bringing this up. And I'm so like, you have to understand that the importance of me to for me to hear that teachers are reading any of my work and it's helping them think about how to do this, like that. I mean, that's where it's at, because that's otherwise, as academics, we just get stuck, whatever, just whistling into the wind, right? And our work doesn't do anything. And so I've got to tell you, I'm just so pleased to hear that you all have been reading that book and really carrying it forward in the stuff that you're doing. So let's start with some history. Going back over 100 years in this country, the earliest standardized tests were given to masses of Army recruits. And these tests were developed by some of the leading psychologists at the time. And it also happens, as Matt talked about, that these leading psychologists were actually believers in eugenics, that basic human behaviors could be attributed to eugenics. Like the basic human behaviors could be attributed to biological, inherited, genetic, like you were born to be this way. Things like criminality. And of course, they were the ones who really, really established the idea that intelligence was a genetic, inborn trait, all right? And that's critical, because if something's inborn, then actually you can't change it, right? So in their mass testing of Army recruits, these guys found that the poor were less intelligent than the rich, and that the darker Southern Europeans were less intelligent than the lighter Northern Europeans, and that blacks were the least intelligent racial group in the United States. Go figure, right? These tests were considered to be objective, and they contributed to the idea that intelligence was just based on biology. Now, this ideology just bled directly into the growing public school system at the time, where testing and tracking literally came together under the idea that schools are supposed to train students for their perceived future social and economic roles in society. The poor were just biologically less intelligent and were going to remain poor, and they should therefore be placed in classes that will train them for their jobs, for the jobs that they will have, and their future as poor people, all right? This is really the origin of the system of tracking, too. You can't separate testing and tracking at all. So whenever I talk about the evils of high-stakes standardized testing, I asked audiences to consider this history for one very important reason. The fact that the test score disparities along the lines of race and economic class have generally remained consistent for over 100 years should make us really question the very foundations of standardized testing in the United States. In the very least, this historic consistency should make us all ask the question, what are these tests actually measuring? Now, personally, I think high-stakes tests measure lots of things, but most of those things have very little to do with teaching and learning. For instance, by and large, I think high-stakes standardized tests measure overall access to educational resources. From the quality of classroom materials, to access to technology, to whether or not a student's parents graduated from college, to a myriad of other purely resource-based variables at home and at school and anywhere in between. Indeed, this is why why we can see such a strong relationship between poverty and test scores. I also think that high-stakes standardized tests provide a measure of a student's relationship with schools. Partly due to a lack of funding and partly due to a lack of will, many students' home languages are not recognized, honored, or supported in schools. Similarly, many students of color do not have their cultural identities supported in the school curriculum generally, and certainly not in the textbooks that are getting used. So given the high rates of unemployment and poverty in communities of color, it is safe to say that for a number of students of color, they just don't simply see the payoff with school, frankly, right? I mean, why spend all this time and energy trying to relate to the institution that feels like it's rejecting you? And statistically speaking, you look around your neighborhood and see that it hasn't paid off for a good chunk of your friends and family, all right? So the tests may not be objective in measuring what we think they're measuring in a general sense. But I also want to take some time to point out some other ways that we should be questioning the simple and neat standardized test scores that we often get when sent home with our kids. For instance, we should really think hard about the kinds of scores we get back on writing exams, okay? Two different authors, and they both have pieces in here in this book. Dan DiMaggio and Todd Farley, they wrote about their experiences working as essay scorers within the test industry. Their reports are really harrowing, all right? The test scoring industry is basically filled with part-time temporary workers, many of whom have no background in education whatsoever. These workers are trained, they get normed to do the tests, and then they're set to go, okay, now you're trained, go grade this kid's test, go grade the test, right? But here's the kicker. Grading the essay tests for these guys is piecework. It's literally like sweatshop labor in the garment industry. Okay, so they're paid by the number of tests they grade, and they're expected to get through hundreds of papers in a day. So even though, as much as we might like to think that the essays that our students have spent hours preparing for and maybe hours writing, we like to think these are getting treated with care, but they aren't, okay? A standardized essay test grader doesn't spend much more than a minute grading each test. If they spend longer, they fall behind quota, and really they're trying to make money, okay? Now, that's bad enough, but it gets worse. Both DiMaggio and Farley actually report that as graders, they were told to change their scores. All right, and this has to get through the politics of the testing. So in order to keep the contracts with the districts and the states, test scoring companies have to show that their tests are reliable. That is, that they can get consistent scores from year to year. And what would happen is the managers would come and say, hey, look, you know, we're not having consistent scores from last year. You guys need to be giving more 4s and 3s. So go ahead, so make sure you're doing that. Okay? I know, it's crazy. It's crazy making. Okay, so the subjectivity of test scores is no more apparent than in the current practice of using tests to measure teacher effectiveness. What I talked about before is called value-added measurement. And under value-added models, statisticians, not educators, statisticians take test scores and do what they call controlling for different variables, okay? With the promise that they're able to tease out a single teacher's impact on a single student's test score. But there are a lot of problems with using value-added models, and I'm going to talk about a few of these. And I really hope SEA keeps these in mind as you guys move forward with negotiations for the next contract. Please, please, please. Make them base what they suggest on research, please. So real briefly, because I'm running out of time here. Tests can't measure for what's called cognitive transfer. So we don't have a way, for instance, to know, say there's a history teacher who's actually doing literacy work with their students, but they're only taking the English test, and that work in the history class can show up in the English side of the test score. And so actually it's not measuring what the English teacher did. It might be measuring what the English teacher and the history teacher did, but there's no way to figure that out. Or you can also have the reverse happen. You might have the history teacher trying to teach the literacy stuff and screwing it up for the English teacher, right? So cognitive transfer, we can't tease that out across, yeah, I'm not, well, they're looking at you, Jesse, I don't know. Another problem with the value-added model is that there are actually really high error rates when you start looking at, when you look at scores and try and make a judgment on a teacher. So if you just have one year's worth of data of test scores, okay, and you try and say this teacher's good or bad, there's actually up to a 35% error rate. Okay, that's over a third, right? And even if you have 3 years of data, you're still looking at around a 25% error rate on making that judgment. Okay, that's a pure statistical error rate. We also see test scores of students varying greatly from year to year, right? So you got to think about this. If the test is supposed to measure how good a teacher is teaching a student, then it shouldn't matter what students they have. You should be able to see the same kind of gains from one year to the next, right? It's just the same teacher. They're good. It's going to show up. But what we're seeing is a teacher in 1 year is like, oh, they're great. They get lauded for raising their kids' test scores. They're in the top, whatever, 10%. And then the next year, they're in the bottom 25, right? And they're like, wait a minute. Either the teacher just tanked it for a year or something happened with the change in student population. And there's also other research that talks about like how much day-to-day factors, and this is really common sense, and I think you all know this, right? If a kid eats breakfast before they take the test, if they had sleep that night before they take the test, if they got into a fight with their mom or dad or whoever, or sister or friend on the way to school, impact before they take the test. Those physical, biological, the social, emotional factors on the day of the test actually contribute to how well they perform, okay? And value-added models can't account for that at all. There's all sorts of other arguments to be made around using tests to evaluate teachers, but I'll just close on one final big one, and that's just that out-of-school factors, non-school factors, have the largest impact on student test scores. We know this over and over again, and we've known this for decades, all right? Issues like housing insecurity, food insecurity, access to consistent medical care for students and their families, they're just overwhelming in terms of defining student performance. And this is what I find so insulting about the use, not only the use of value-added measurement to measure teachers, but just our general assumptions about the objectivity of high-stakes standardized tests. Corporate education reformers are spending their time, their energy, and literally hundreds of millions of dollars trying to find ways to statistically control for out-of-school factors like the ones I just talked about. For them, it's not the kids and the teachers and the actual conditions that matter, right? It's strictly a numbers game. And they act like if they can just find the right formulas, the right tweaks to the equations, that they can get the numbers to add up and to figure out the magic, right? Figure out the silver bullet. But in the process, what happens is they end up really purposefully avoiding the real-world issues that we know affect students by any measure, all right? So that's, I mean, really, that's really it in a nutshell to me. We end up using high-stakes test scores as a shell game, as a way to distract from the issues that we know actually contribute to student achievement. And so I think what's happening with the Seattle teachers, and it's bigger than Garfield and bigger than like just you guys, we know that now. That's why it's been so powerful for people around the country. Anyways, that's what I had. Thank you for your time and energy. I know it's getting late and we're getting tired, but thank you.
I just want to say that there are lots of ways we can define student growth, in my opinion, that are better than standardized tests, and I think reading Wayne Al's book is critical to that because the last chapter is about the alternatives. So at Garfield High School, there's a wide range of opinions on what should replace the MAP. Some people would replace it with a standardized test that's at least aligned to our curriculum, that one that at least doesn't have a higher margin of error than expected gains. That you'd think that could be a baseline. But many of us feel like standardized testing is just running wild, and it's eating up way too many resources, and it's not an accurate measure. We have 5 state-mandated standardized tests that all 9th and 10th graders have to pass already. So to add something else on top of that that would be used to evaluate teacher performance, I think, in my opinion, is outrageous. And I think I want to move towards things like performance-based assessments and portfolios, right? How do you get your PhD? You have to do research, and then you have to defend that, right, to a committee that is experts in that field. And that's actually, I think, a model that we can adapt to different subject areas and to different grade levels, where you're actually doing meaningful research towards the goals that the class has. And it's not something that's imposed from people outside of the state that are profiting off of this standardized test around things that you're not even teaching. So I think that would, if we were able to take this movement and help it produce a better contract, that would be, to me, an incredible gain from the MAP test boycott, to show the entire country that we can define student growth outside of standardized testing. And just the last thing I'll say is on the Chicago Teachers Union, I think shows what it takes to win. If we're going to fight for a contract like that, we are going to have solidarity with parents, and we're going to have to build those alliances, and we're going to have to be ready to say, just like the Garfield High School teachers, I mean, I'm a history teacher, so I'm not in the tested subject, and for me to see the courageous reading and math and language arts teachers refuse to give a test knowing the consequences is incredible. And I think that's a lesson that all of our unions can take, that when something is wrong for our kids, we have to stand up and we have to do whatever it takes. And if that's job actions, then I think we need to take inspiration from these teachers who are risking so much. Thank you.
You had asked, what can students do? A couple of things just off the top of my head, what that would be great is if you could, first of all, boycott the test yourself, and that can be just you refusing to take it, or very importantly, ask your parent, tell your parents that you want to be opted out of it, and encourage other students to have their parents opt them out of it as well. Because if no one shows up for the test, then you can't have a test. So that's what I would encourage you to do at the very, very least.
The night before the administrators came to our classes at Garfield and took the students out, the night before that we sat down, we were thinking, how do we respond to this? We've done everything we know how to do. The only things left to us would disrupt school, and we're not willing to do that. That's why we're objecting to the MAP test, is because it disrupts school, so we can't do that. And we just threw up our hands and came to school, and we're ready to be sad. And standing out in front of my classroom and standing out in front of everybody else's classroom were hordes of students with leaflets that said, you don't have to take this test, you can sit politely and quietly and not do anything. You don't have to respond, and you have that right. And almost none of my students took the test that day.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that leaflet for the rest of my life.